All right. Well, good morning, everybody. This
Yes,
is an
good morning.
exciting day. I'm Jeff Wyron with Premier Property Group. I am the incoming vice chair for the Board of Managers for OREF.
That's a long title.
Yeah, I think so. And you are?
I am Steve Russell. I'm with Windermere Realty Trust, and I was the 2017 chair of the OREF Forms Committee. And both Jeff and I welcome you to the webinar today.
Yeah, this is always one of my favorite classes because, so much happens throughout the course of the year on the Forms Committee. I can't hear.
But we're being so clever.
I think they can hear. Did everybody say they can't hear? Okay, well, we're going to keep going and let Monica do her thing, but we're going to assume you can hear us. So, yeah, anyway, this is one of my favorite classes throughout the year just because of the changes and all of the volume of work that goes into the Forms Committee. And the changes are good. And every year it comes through the suggestions of the subscribers who actually use the forms. And it's a great product at the end of the day. So what we're going to do is just dive right in. I know in past webinars, if you have questions, we've been able to kind of get through your questions as we go through. Today, we're not going to be able to do that. We will, if we have time at the end of the webinar today, take your questions. But if we aren't able to get to your questions, then feel free to contact OREF and or your principal broker. And I would always say, as I know you would too, Steve, anything that we say to you here, any advice you might give by your question or contacting OREF, always vet with your managing principal broker. They're ultimately the one who's responsible for your real estate activity, as are you. And so we want to make sure to give that advice. So we're just going to go ahead and jump right in. And the most changes and the biggest changes come to the sale agreement, of course. So let's kick it off and get started.
All right. A couple of notes here. Also, if you have the handout is exactly what you're seeing on the screen. So that should be consistent with that. Hopefully it's in color because the sections we are going to be working on are all highlighted that we're going to be discussing. I don't believe there's anything that is not. Also, as far as the forms, if we had printed out everything and put in here, it would have been 100 pages long or so, and all the color printers would have been sad. So the residential sale agreement is complete. There's a couple of other forms that are complete, but on other ones, we've only included the page that actually has a change. And we'll try to be diligent on saying, okay, this is this form when we're talking about this page in those cases where we don't have the full one. Like, for example, there's just one thing that's on the new construction sale agreement, so we just use that one page. No use doing everything else, which was exactly the same as the residential. Okay, so with that disclaimer, let's get moving on.
Right.
Okay, the first one we're going through, this actually is not in yellow after I just said that.
Because you'd have to highlight the whole agreement.
I have to highlight the whole agreement or not highlight the whole agreement because it's not there. The situation you have seen for years where it would say buyer or buyer's agent, seller or seller's agent. And that was all the way through, which was cumbersome. It just slows down the reading process in your head. It just kind of put a snag there. Well, based upon, we already have in the verbiage in the definitions and instruction section states delivery to the agent has the same effect as delivery to the client. So actually putting in the sale agreement, buyer or buyer's agent, seller or seller's agent, just wasn't necessary. So now through the course of the agreement, you'll see buyer, seller. Nothing has changed. If you're the buyer's agent, you're not walking up and giving anything to the seller. If you're the seller's agent, you're not going over and working with the buyer. You're still working through the agent. But just as far as this contract, it just states buyer and seller.
The other thing that I like about that change is it really clarifies that this is an agreement between those two parties, those two principals. And I think that, that's just a hyper detail, but an important one. And I'm regularly talking with brokers about, it's not your agreement, it's their agreement. You're not inserting yourself into the agreement. So, hyper detail, but good.
No, that was a nice point. I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, this next section, it was just a clarification. It's been kind of wanky for the longest time because it said fixtures. And then in there it was said including remote controls. Well, no, a remote control is not a fixture, but we didn't have any place else to put it.
Right.
So I just kind of tightened it up a little bit and made it so it actually makes sense. So that the new title is Fixtures, Controls, and Keys. And it says fixtures and essential related equipment, example, remote controls, and all keys relating to the property, including mailbox, outbuildings, et cetera, to be included. Which I think, I'm glad that we added also the mailbox key, because that seems like that's a fairly consistent. Oh, I needed to give that. So anyway, now it's in there, and so you don't have to say you have to do it. The contract says they have to do it. So you're really good right going on through there.
Yeah, and this is a section of the sale agreement that I regularly am encouraging agents to refer to if there's a problem post-closing. Oh, they didn't leave this, or they didn't leave that, or, whatever. This is important. It's important language. Glad that you were able to clean that up.
Okay, good deal. This next one, it's always been an issue. It still needs to be clarification. As you all know, when there's a VA loan, there's what we've been calling a buyer's non-allowable VA fees, something that the buyer can't pay. Okay, and then the problem we were having is if there was closing costs. So somebody would say, seller to pay $5,000 of buyer's closing costs and prepaids, and then it wasn't clear, were these not allowable close fees in there or not? Was the seller okay with that or not? So now it actually states it in there that whether the seller shall or shall not agree to pay the non-allowable VA fees. One caveat there, of course, is the buyer can't pay them. However, the lender can. So before you're getting your loan together, contact the lender that your buyer has and say, okay, what's going on with the VA non-allowable fees, and get their input before you started saying shall or shall not on the agreement.
Yeah. Yeah, and there are a couple of those fees. Like, for example, I think they can't pay the escrow fee. They can't pay some of the fees that are typically split between the buyer and the seller. Those are the fees that we're really talking about. And
Right.
That doesn't apply on every federal VA loan, which it used to, right? I mean,
Right.
It used to. If you were getting a federal VA loan, there were those fees that just the buyer could not pay. The federal VA said the buyer will not be responsible for these fees. And that's different now, depending upon their specific loan product.
Correct.
So there is the opportunity for the buyer to pay those. But, I always like to talk with the seller if they're getting a loan from a VA buyer that, hey, if you're going to agree to this, if you're going to agree to pay this, you need to know that, especially if there's multiple offers, you could end up paying $500 to $1,000-ish more to close this transaction than you would for a non-federal VA buyer.
So getting it out there so everybody understands this is a good thing.
Yeah, excellent. Excellent.
Okay. I'm going to scroll down here a little bit.
Yeah.
I still think it's nice that you have a full agreement in front of you on this one. Okay. We had a situation with closing costs, and I'm sure you guys have had issues with the closing costs, where what we were just talking about, that the seller is going to contribute X amount of dollars towards the buyer's closing costs and prepaids. People were not sure where to put it. So we've seen them put it as a financing contingency. We've seen them put in the contingent source of funds area.
Right.
And we've seen them put here in the additional financing provision section. And the other two places weren't correct, but if it was in there, the intent was there, so we just kind of moved on. However, we're using an example in this additional financing provision saying example closing costs. So hopefully everyone out there, when they're in a situation when there's those closing costs that the buyer wants the seller to pay, this is the place, the only place you need to put it. You don't need to put it in 3 times, just here.
Yeah, and this section of the sale agreement was specifically created when we revised the form the other year because people used to put it in additional provisions, right? Which makes sense. But the reason that this additional financing provisions was created and added here was exactly for the purpose of the buyer being able to tell the seller within the financing contingency section if the buyer wanted to have the seller contribute any amount towards their closing costs. So this item was created for exactly that purpose. And the thinking was, if the seller should see all of the details of the financing within that financing contingency section, not see, oh, buyer's going to get this kind of a loan and this is their pre-approval and all of the details of that, and then 4 pages later on additional provisions, see, oh, they're asking for me to pay their closing costs as part of their financing, how does that work? And So
Yeah.
now you can discuss it all at one time when you're talking through the sale agreement. You're talking through financing with your seller. It's all there. That's the reason that exists. So
Perfect.
I'm glad for the clarification, because that's the whole point of it. If you're
Yeah.
not putting it there, there's no need for that, quite frankly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to go down. Here's a little clarification, and this falls under the, I didn't see a problem, but it was a problem, so we tried to correct it.
Okay.
The situation was this. I'm going to read it the way it was written. We only added the words "for example." So invasive inspections that may include testing or removal of any portion of the property, including radon and mold. That's the way it used to read, including radon and mold. And then down below on the next page, there's the invasive inspections that you have to identify down here on line 196. Well, people were saying, well, I didn't have to put radon and mold because it was up on top already, which to me...
They didn't read the full sentence.
They didn't read the full sentence. So that's okay. These are things that are good for you, because to have to try to explain that to a co-op agent, and it creates angst. So to eliminate some angst going on in that situation, we just clarified it with saying the property including, for example, radon and mold.
Yeah.
So if you want a radon and mold inspection, you need to identify both of those in the invasive inspection. Just because they're written on line 183 doesn't give you a free pass. You have to include them.
Yeah, or you can use OREF 058, the professional inspection,
Oh, yeah.
and identify them there. And, just for the benefit of people understanding the history of that, the whole language there, adding those two inspections specifically, was because, you've got a buyer that's doing a sewer scope, for example, or a radon test. A seller shows up at their house, and there's a big placard on their front door that says, "Oh, radon testing in progress. You've got to leave the house closed for 48 hours." And, they have a 3-story townhouse or whatever, right? And they've got an infant baby who sleeps at the 3rd story, and they don't have air conditioning, and it's 95 degrees in the summer, and you've got a seller at that point who's probably a little bit uptight and out of sight about the fact that they weren't notified there was going to be this radon test, and they were going to be expected to, keep close home conditions or whatever. So it's just for the sake of making sure that all parties understand the scope of the inspections that are going to be done. And of course, anything that's invasive, or that damages the property, the buyer knows that they have to get permission for that and put the property back.
Correct. Excellent. Okay,
all right.
We're going to go down to the lead-based paint. Okay, a couple of things happened in this lead-based paint this year, and Phil Querin did a great job of putting some of this together. The first part was some inconsistency with the disclosure, the time period. And it's written twice, and when we get to lead-based paint, we'll quickly go through the changes too, but there was twice on the lead-based paint addendum, it talks about how many days they have. And also on the sale agreement, it stated how many days they have, and they weren't consistent. One said 10 days or greater. One just said 10 days. I can't remember what the third one said, but they're all three that were different. So to make it consistent, they're all saying the same thing. Now, the only place where where you can actually fill in the amount of time is on the residential is line 206 there, where it states buyer shall have blank calendar days, 10, or other mutually agreed upon period. You can put less than 10 days. It looked like this, as we all know, this is a federal law, and the way it was originally read, they felt like it had to be a minimum of 10 days. But again, Phil went back, they did some checking, and says, no, it's just anything that can be mutually agreed to. So now both places on the lead-based paint and the sale agreement are consistent. But when you fill out, if you want something other than 10, this is where you need to fill it out. You don't there's no place on the actual lead-based paint addendum to fill in the amount of time. The second part that was put in here was people were feeling that the lead-based paint contingency period was used as a kind of a get-out-of-jail-free situation where a buyer could say, hey, I can just get out because no one's going to argue with the lead-based paint. It's federal law. So I'm getting out based upon the lead-based paint, and they're just getting out. So this is different, and really note something that's quite different from this and the inspection period, because we're talking about an inspection for lead-based paint.
Right.
But this is set up differently. Okay, so let's just read through it. I'm going to start on line 207. If lead-based paint and/or lead-based paint hazards are identified in the property by a certified inspector at any time before expiration of the lead-based paint contingency period, buyer may unconditionally cancel this transaction by written notice to seller, notice of cancellation. In such case, buyer shall deliver a copy of any written reports or evaluations, collectively reports, to seller together with the notice of cancellation, and thereafter receive a prompt refundable earnest money deposits. So in this case, you can't get out of this unless there's actually been a risk assessment or an inspection to determine if there is any lead in the home. That has to occur. You just can't use it without having anything done. And you have to give that report at the time that you terminate that report to the seller, as opposed to the inspection period, which states you only give the inspection report if the seller says it's okay and requests it. So there's a difference going on here, but it was really to tighten up what people were perceiving was a loophole to get out of the sale.
Yeah, so point of clarity is, like on the inspection contingency, it states that you have to have, you can unconditionally disapprove of the property based on the inspection report. The implication is you've had an inspection, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that same thing is being stated here. You have to actually have had the inspection in order to terminate. But beyond that, it says if lead-based paint and/or lead-based paint hazards are identified in the property. So even if a buyer has a lead-based paint test and nothing is identified, they don't have the right to terminate based
Correct.
on this contingency.
Yep.
That's an important point. And I train on these forms a lot, as I'm sure you do, not only in formal settings, but one-on-one with brokers on a regular basis. A lot of people still aren't aware that this is a calendar day provision. If you want to make these timelines line up, if you're doing a 10 business day inspection period for the regular inspection period, and you want this time period to match that, you need to make it 14 calendar days, which is the effective 10 business days, right? So people don't get that either, I think, a lot of times.
Right. And the other, since we brought that up, since this is a federal law, this is the one time frame that ends at midnight and doesn't end at 5 p.m.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Okay, I'm supposed to be doing a page identification. This is page 5. Oh, we have.
Are we on page 5? Yeah.
Okay.
I was just looking down. All right.
Okay. This is just a little piece, but I'm liking it, and I believe it's going to be, we're going to be the forms committee with Wendy, who's going to be doing a fabulous job this next year. I'm sure she'll be awesome as the chair. I know this is on her agenda as well. As you know, when you're in zip forms, you only see if it's not a very, very short title for the document, you only see a part of it. And a lot of them start with addendum. All right, so you're scrolling through there and you're looking through. Well, we're trying to make it so you can find these a little more easily. And so really the only change here on line 217 on page 5 of what you have here, a septic on-site sewage system. This used to be an on-site septic sewage system. So on-site was the first word. So if you were looking for a sewer, something regarding a sewer, you had to look under O, which didn't make a whole lot of sense unless you did it all the time.
Right.
So we're doing that here, and there's a couple of other places we're going to point that out as we go through, but I believe next year several forms are going to be modified, retitled to make it easier. Jeff did an awesome job on the contingency ones. Now the contingency agreement and the notices are all right next to each other, which just makes the whole thing easier. So that's page 5 there.
Good, and that's a specific reference to the new title of that actual document.
Correct.
As well.
That's correct.
Okay. All right, great. No changes to seller representations, but always a good thing for you as an agent to read through and make sure that you understand what the boilerplate language states in regard to what a seller is representing when they agree to the offer, from the standpoint that if the seller can't be honestly making one of these representations, it needs to be countered out. If they sign the sale agreement and accept it as it is, they're saying that they can agree to all of those representations. Right.
Yeah, I think sometimes people kind of zip through that when they're having the seller sign that. Okay. FERPTA. Okay, we're not going to talk a lot about FERPTA here, but here there was a clarification. As we know, this is an IRS federal law. No one likes it. we can all agree on that, I think. But universally, no realtors like this. However, we have to deal with it. Again, we'll talk about it more when we get actually to the advisory and the addendum later. But just on here, it clarified in here with, if a withholding requirement needs to be done, it's 10% if, between 300 and a million, 300,000 and $1 million. But then if it's $1 million or more, it's 15%. So just kind of getting our little math hats on, that change, we just want to clarify, they broke it apart, made it look even clearer, but that's quite a amount of withholding to be withheld on $1 million sale, $150,000. So just making that note, if you're working with anybody who happens to be a foreign person and having the FIRPTA withholding requirement, it's, can they actually sell the home?
Yeah, or, you know, does it put it into a negative equity position?
Right.
Right, yeah, that makes sense. And, you know, I've been in real estate 13 years, and I've yet to do a transaction where FIRPTA applied, and I don't think very many people do, but it's just kind of one of those things where when it applies, it is a big deal. And you need to know and make sure that your clients know what to do with it.
Absolutely.
And that it's properly disclosed, so.
Okay, and we'll talk about it later, just what you wanted to do,
We're still on page 6,
We're
right?
still on page 6.
All right, great.
All right. Let's see, line 281. Or if 024 Townhome Plan Community / and this was in addition, Homeowners Association Addendum, because we felt like the name wasn't quite long enough, so I made it really long. And the reason for it was this. As you all know, if it's a condo, you're going to be using the condominium sale agreement. But if it's a townhome, and if it's a townhome, you're going to be adding to the residential sale agreement this Townhome Plan Community Homeowners Association Addendum to the sale agreement. The reason we added the Homeowners Association Addendum is we were finding that, just as managing principal brokers, there's a lot of homeowners associations that are not in a townhome. It's a big subdivision or a small subdivision. And these forms weren't being used. And your buyer needs, just basically think of this, even though it starts with townhome, think of this as a homeowners association addendum. If there's a homeowners association, put this form in here. Even if there's only a couple of docs, get it into there. I'll use my own HOA as an example. I have one. I think they have meetings once a year. They don't have notes. There's no figuring out how much money we have. Is it going to be enough and stuff? Because there's not much involved there. And it's only $250 a year. Great. Okay, we have 2 ponds on our property. So, mainly what our $250 pays for with our group of homes is liability insurance in case something happened horribly at the lakes. Well, for a buyer coming in, they need to know that information. They need to know this because they're actually they would be potentially on the hook if something happened over there. So you need to get that information. So really be thinking about this as a homeowners association addendum and not a townhome addendum.
I'm glad for the clarification. I think it's important. Since we've made this change in the agreement, I've tried to be very diligent about utilizing it whenever I sell a home that's in an HOA, whenever I represent a buyer purchasing a home that's in an HOA. But it's been kind of all over the board from people not, you know, I've even delivered the information to buyer's agent with an addendum and had them not respond to it, you know, because I don't think they perceived that it was necessary, right? And I agree with you. I think the bottom line here, the reason we made this change initially the other year was because it's material information that a buyer should know, regardless of the size of the HOA or the scope of the HOA. The purchaser of the property is going to become either a part owner of the HOA or at least a member of the HOA with a voting right, with all of the rights and responsibilities and liabilities that come with that. So they need to know what they're buying.
Absolutely.
It's a fundamental part of their purchase. It really is. And I just think that a lot of people still don't quite comprehend that in full. I think there's a lot of people out there who think it's a little bit of an overthink on the, you know, part of the forms committee or whatever. And in my opinion, it's really not. It's a fundamental part of the purchase. If you're purchasing a property that's in an HOA, you need to know as the buyer, and you need to know what it's all about and what your liabilities are.
Perfect,
Okay.
perfect. And one small little touch at the end of this is, we just changed the language. It used to state seller will provide,
Mm-hmm.
and it was just wrong.
Right.
So now, and so it was corrected, it was brought to our attention, somebody made a suggestion to the ORF committee, we review all of those,
Will be attached.
and so we just changed it to will be attached.
Yeah.
Because that was a little wanky. And finally, on alarm systems, same page, now we put in an unknown box, because a lot of times, pretty much if you're gonna be making an offer as a buyer's agent, you're gonna be calling the agent and saying, is the property available? And, one of the other ones is asking about the alarm system. It always has been one of those things where you're going to be doing it. But sometimes you don't know, or you're not sure, or whatever the case may be. So now there's an unknown box. Now, so that's good, because now you just don't leave it blank.
Right.
You actually thought about it, and you weren't able to get the information. However, don't leave it there. If you mark unknown, get that clarified later on in the sale agreement. You can get to mutual agreement with the unknown, that's fine. But for your buyer, and also for the seller, both parties need to know what's going on there. So clarify that at some point later on in the agreement.
Yeah, which, I'm assuming is going to happen at the home inspection point at very
Right.
latest.
Yes.
Right. But yeah, a lot of times when you show a property, you're not thinking to look about the alarm system, because it's just not a feature that, a lot of buyers are too in tune with.
No.
But you can see it in the RMLS on the interior features, whether it's own security system or lease security system. There is language, but your information is only as good as the people putting it in.
Yes, we've never seen something incorrect on our
Right.
RMLS.
No. All right, moving on to page 7.
Okay, page 7. This is a biggie. Okay.
Yeah.
So I just start off with the big part. There is no promissory note. It was taken out. What Phil has a really good discussion, and I really would encourage you to go back and read that summary. He does a great job of explaining this, but I'm just going to paraphrase it or just give my own points on this. It was taken up. First off, the problem was with the whole, if you have a promissory note that has an electronic signature on it, what's the original? And so that was really confusing, and the OIR had made a determination that they still need a note in the file stating that an original was given back to the buyer at whether it didn't go through or when it was redeemed.
Right.
And this was just really cumbersome, and it just seemed like
Never happened.
It was what, and I'm betting everybody's file out there have a bunch of them sitting in there, and rightfully so. They changed that to that we needed to have proof that the note was redeemed, that the client had been notified of the redemption, and a copy of escrow's receipt for the cash paid upon redemption was sent to the client. So that was, they sort of modified it for us a little bit, but it was still there. So that's where it started, but then it moved on to, well, do we need it? And so there was research done, not by the Farms Committee, but by the attorneys involved, and checked several other states, and many of the states were confused when they even said promissory note, because they were thinking, note, are you talking about the note in the trust deed? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
They didn't even, and they were saying, well, why do you have a promissory note on your sale agreement? They didn't even know why it was going on. So with that analysis and with also the issues with electronic signatures on promissory notes, we took them out. And it's still a legal binding contract, absolutely. Okay, so, but read all the way through here. I'm going to read this.
Okay.
On lines 306, when this sale agreement is signed and accepted by buyer and seller, the following instructions that shall immediately apply to the handling of buyer's earnest money deposit. Okay? The deposit shall be payable by electric funds transfer or check drawn and collected funds and deposited within 3 business days if not filled in, which is the deposit deadline, as follows. Okay, so this is going to do a couple of things. One, the promissory note was always sort of a strange item because the client would give the note, would come in with a check to the agent, hand them the check. If everything was done correctly, then they would get the return note receipt, and there was all that stuff going on. And let's say that the note had said 3 business days. Okay, so now the buyer's agent has it. When do they have to get it to escrow? And it was actually a little fuzzy. Some people said, well, you know, they redeemed it in 3 days, and so now they have some extra time to put it in. And or some people say, no, the whole thing has to happen within 3 business days. But it wasn't written that way. So I really like this now because it's 3 business days. It states what it is. Now, if you're in a situation with a buyer where you know that they're going to be out of town for a while and stuff like that, really be paying attention to this and say, okay, maybe you'll have to write in 5. Of course, you'll need to explain that to the seller's agent, why it would be that way. But make sure that now it's very specific. That money has to be given to either the client trust account or to escrow in that period of time. There's no fluffy thing going on there right now. So they can deposit directly with escrow, directly in a buyer's agent's firm's client trust account and remain there until disbursement at closing, or directly into buyer's agent's firm client a trust account and thereafter deposit with escrow title prior to closing, or as follows. And Phil, in his summary, had stated you could use a promissory note, and if you wanted to use a promissory note and create one, you could put as follows and put a note in there. Now, I had, on this one, I just taught a little class for my own branch as a practice to get this stuff together, but also to get that through there, maybe a perk of me being gone this next month. Universally, they were pleased with the fact of not having to mess around with that promissory note. It was really a good thing. And then down below, it reiterates and enforces this. So when you're going through with your client, I like having this here, lines 314 through 316. The deposit payable by whatever method selected by a buyer shall be placed with escrow or buyer's agent firm's client trust account no later than 5 p.m. on the last day of the deposit deadline. The failure to do so may result in a breach of the sale agreement under earnest money payment refund section below. So it's right there. I like that. Instead of having to read down a little bit further, they put that right there.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I think the other thing that is important, and some practical comments in regard to this. First, the buyer is responsible for their earnest money and for depositing their earnest money, which I'm glad for this change because I think that's how it should be.
Mm-hmm.
The buyer's transaction, they should be the one responsible for the earnest money. You as the buyer's agent, previous to this change, were signing the sale agreement. Quite frankly, I think a lot of agents didn't realize why they had to sign the sale agreement.
Yep.
Their signature was stating that they have received the earnest money from the buyer. It was a signature of receipt, right?
Yep.
And so all of the burdens of what do you have to do with the money that you've received on behalf of your client in order to be compliant with the Oregon Real Estate Agency apply. Of course they do. The way that it is right now, this document now, as it reads, puts the burden on the buyer. Here's the instructions for when you have to deposit your earnest money, but you're committing the earnest money by making the offer. So it's still an earnest money agreement.
Yep.
And it's still a valid agreement because the buyer is making the commitment, but now they're responsible for delivery of it, right? And if they don't deliver it, then there, could be penalties, right? There could be an issue, right? They could be in breach of the sale agreement under the earnest money payment refund, as it says on line 315 to 316. So I think this is important for agents to understand and really get their mind around. It is a change of practice, but I think a very positive one. What I foresee is a lot of agents interpreting that what they have to do is, instead of getting a promissory note, collect a check from their buyer at the time of writing the offer. And that is not the case.
Nope.
No. Now, if an agent chooses to do that, you need to talk with your principal broker about that, because it doesn't matter whether you sign that you're receiving the funds on behalf of your client. If you, in fact, are receiving the funds from your client, you have responsibilities for accounting of those funds, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you need to talk to your managing principal broker about whether or not they want you to be in that position. For an agent who only sells a home or two a month, which is still decent volume, okay, well, you've got a check, you can quantify it, it's right there in your file, you're going to deposit it as soon as the offer is accepted. But what if you're doing 5-10 deals a week? How easy would it be to lose sight of a check and not know exactly which desk drawer it's in, for heaven's sake, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not trying to be ridiculous, but I am trying to be dramatic to prove a point. Be careful about this. This specifically does not require you as an agent to collect a check at the time of preparation of the offer. What it specifically does, it puts the burden of the deposit of the earnest money onto the buyer, not you, right?
Absolutely.
I want to make that point extremely clear to everybody that's listening, that you can share with anybody else you talk to. This does not mean, because there's no promissory note, that you have to receive a check at the time of offer preparation. In fact, in my opinion, you should not. The burden is with the buyer. The buyer needs to deposit the funds in accordance with what's stated here, and that's it, right?
Absolutely. And when I was teaching it yesterday, everybody went, "Oh, that's awesome."
No, I think it's a great change. I really do. I think people don't understand it, and I think people understand it in a different way. So I want to make that point clear. I've seen some Facebook posts, and the Masters of the Universe Facebook page, or whatever they call it. There's consternation about it, where there shouldn't be, because it's a great change, and I think it's a necessary change. So anyway, all right.
Okay. All right, moving down on the same page, so we're still on page 7.
Yeah.
Okay. There's one change you'll see at the end of the earnest money payment to seller. But really what they did here, and as I'm sure Jeff had when he was reading through this word for word with a new agent and going through here, this used to be one paragraph, and it was really hard to read because it had the legalese run-on sentences going on, and it was very difficult. So now it's very specific. The earnest money refund to buyer has a section. Nothing has changed. Well, excuse me. They took out the promissory note verbiage.
Yeah.
But when they did that, they also split that apart, and I think it was great. I don't remember us talking about it, but they did it, and I love it. And then the earnest money payment to seller is split apart. Now, the next section was added, and it's on parts on page 7, and the next is on page 8. The parties expressly agree that seller's economic and non-economic damages arising from buyer's failure to close this transaction in accordance with the terms of this agreement would be difficult or impossible to ascertain with any certainty, and that said earnest money deposits identified herein shall represent a binding liquidated sum, and that, I'm pointing at Jeff, and I could do this myself, a fair, reasonable, and appropriate pre-estimate of seller's damages and is not a penalty. Okay, just be paying attention to this. Part of this liquidated damages clause, because it was clarified that it's not punitive. So before it had some sentences in here about, we're all feeling like, okay, the only thing that the buyer has on the line, if they don't comply with the terms of the contract, is their earnest money. There's nothing beyond the earnest money. That's the extent of their liability. And then it had this line about an ORS statute, and everybody was kind of wondering what it was. And part of it was with this punitive damages section. Okay. So let's say, as an example, somebody was buying a $300,000 house, and they decided to really make their offer look awesome, so they're making their earnest money $100,000 on a $300,000 house.
Right.
Okay? And then the check bounces. It was just a mistake. They had the monies, okay, but it was, okay, based upon the language in here, their earnest money at that particular point is at risk. Here it's stating that that's not punitive, okay? Whereas the ORS, that one law I was talking about, had basically said it couldn't be punitive. So they're putting this in here to basically state, if you're putting that earnest money in there, no matter how much earnest money you're putting in, if you default, the seller has entitled to those monies, or potentially entitled to those monies. So that's a difference that's been going forward. Now, how often does somebody do that? Not very often. But really, if somebody's coming up and thinks as a strategy to put a great deal of earnest money down might be a good strategy, again, inform your client, okay, that wouldn't be considered punitive, so if you...
Yeah, it's a real risk.
It's a real risk. So just let your client know, then they can make their decision from that.
Yeah, I think that's good clarification, and I think that's good language, and good.
Okay.
All right. Anything else on page 8?
I don't think so.
All right.
Just cruising along here.
Page 9.
All right. Utilities, just a little clarification here. Again, we're trying to help everybody out. This was a recommendation, so I say we were trying to help out. The recommendation was trying to help everybody out, and we agreed. Seller shall not terminate or disconnect electric, gas, heating, fuel, propane, or water utilities prior to closing unless parties agree otherwise in writing. It's great we can do that, and because now we're having situations where the seller gets an offer in their home and they're really tight on money, and they say, oh great, I'm just going to turn off my water, I'm going to turn off my electricity, I'm going to turn off my gas because I don't have to pay for that for the next 45 days until it closes. And now the agent's having to say, no, you need to keep that on, and they say, why? And they say, well, because you need to. Now you can sit there and say, well, I'd love it if you left your property off there and your pipes froze, but you really can't because contractually you agreed to keep it on.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think that was always kind of implied but never specifically stated. So
right.
I think that's good language, Ed. All right, bottom of page 9, on to dispute resolution, everybody's favorite subject.
Okay. This was clarified a bit. Phil went through some changes in here. I found this interesting, being on the Forms Committee, about this. I had no idea. I think all of us have been out there thinking, okay, we have the dispute resolution section. If it's $10,000 or less, it's going to be in small claims court. If it's over $10,000, it's the mediation arbitration, and we have had all the verbiage to make that go. Well, I discovered that's not necessarily the case. This could come across a judge's desk. An attorney could be arguing that they want to litigate this, and some of the judges have said, you're right, this isn't going to go to mediation arbitration, this will actually go to court, which I went, no way. How is that possible? This is what we're signing. That's what
right.
Not we signing, this is what the clients are signing contractually. So Phil changed verbiage in here to make it even tighter in the fact of, no, mediation and arbitration is what they have contractually agreed to. One party can't sit there, who has a real savvy attorney, sit there and try to put this into court. So here's the added language. All claims, controversies, and disputes between seller, buyer, agents, and or firms relating to the enforcement or interpretation of the sale agreement, including those for rescission, as well as those relating to the validity or scope of the sale agreement, and all matters concerning the jurisdiction of the arbitrators and or arbitration service of Portland to hear and decide questions of arbitrability, that's a new word for the day, herein collectively referred to as claims, shall be exclusively resolved in accordance with the procedure set forth herein, which will survive closing or early termination of this transaction. So this is something we thought was there already, but Phil felt like adding this language would just make it a little bit tougher for a judge to circumvent what the parties had agreed to. Because he even stated, and again, you go back and read his notes, he does a nice job. It states in an ORS statute, no court shall intervene. So, and he has like 4 different examples of that. So it's not going to change anything we're doing here, but just a clarification that it's more likely to be the way we've thought it's going to be all along.
Yeah, and I mean, the dispute resolution section, and this is a good time, anytime there's a change, it's a good time to have a conversation. And, you as a managing broker, me as a managing broker, oftentimes the average agent is probably not likely to have a dispute really ever come up.
Right.
Hopefully. And so I think a lot of people don't really understand the dispute resolution because it's not something you deal with every day. In our capacities, we deal with it probably more frequently than the average agent. So, I'm regularly having to tell an agent if there's a dispute that's come up after closing, really all you can do is refer your client to the dispute resolution procedures that are outlined in the sale agreement and, facilitate them taking that course of action, right? You can't be an attorney for them. You can't resolve the dispute for them. They have to do it in accordance with these procedures. And if your client didn't even have any idea that there was a dispute resolution section of the sale agreement, that's not a good position for you to be in. So even though it's not something for the average broker who's listening to this webinar right now, even though you may never deal with it, and I certainly hope you never do, it does come up from time to time. And the position you want to be able to be in if there is a dispute after closing is to be able to say to your client, you have to review the sale agreement. Here it is. Here's the dispute resolution section that we discussed when you made your offer and that you received the offer, and that all parties agreed to be bound by in regard to resolving any disputes that may have come up. There's the instructions. You got to follow those instructions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And as a managing principal broker, I'll also add, if you get a call like that, especially from an attorney who says, oh, I just want to get some information, at that particular time, just say thank you, get their number, and go see your managing principal broker.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I definitely talk to your managing principal broker.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. So
page 11, is this the last page of the sale agreement, Steve?
I think it is.
I don't even think we've been talking for an hour, and we're already at the last page of the sale agreement.
Hey, we'll give you 2 hours for an hour.
Okay.
All right. All right. Couple of big changes here. It started off. Well, I don't know where it started off, but the whole section with late acceptance has been a big issue. As we all know, it's gone through different transformations. It used to be, when it became an issue, they stuck it into the acknowledgement section where you can either agree or disagree, and you have 2 business days if not filled in, and you put this whole thing together, and then we split that out, and so now there's an acknowledgement section, then a late acceptance section to try to clarify it, and then we added, okay, delivery information, and that was clarifying and also making confusing at the same time. And so that wasn't working. So what was done on the late acceptance was we took out that section which states that you have 2 business days to agree or disagree and things like that. The offer deadline is the offer deadline, all right? So if it's January 4th, at 5 p.m. is the deadline for the offer, and then the seller signs it on January 5th at 3 o'clock in the morning or whatever, you do not have mutual agreement. We all know that. It was after that. And be sure and look at that. I'm surprised by how many sales with savvy agents come across where we actually don't have mutual agreement going on. If that occurs, now these notes from 495 to 498 on page 11, if delivery transmission occurs after the offer deadline identified at offer to purchase section above, it will not become binding upon seller and buyer unless the parties agree to extend said deadline by an addendum, counteroffer, or other writing jointly signed by the parties. The parties' failure to do so shall be treated as a rejection under seller's rejection section below, and this transaction shall be automatically terminated. You'll note that there's not a time frame on here, and part of that was, as a managing principal broker, I would review something, and I'm not reviewing it within the 2 business days.
Yeah.
By the time I'm doing it, it might be 5 days later. And I'd note this, and there was, now what do you do?
Yeah.
And people were kind of doing it anyway on an addendum.
You can go down the wormhole pretty far with that rationale.
Oh, yeah, and so it was really, it was a mess. So this clarifies it. Now, if you do a counter, I think probably a counteroffer is the cleanest, because now, even if you're not countering anything other than you're giving a longer period of time for everybody to agree, there's all the sign and agree to language. It's all nice and tidy. So I myself would prefer a counteroffer there. However, you can do an addendum and just extend the closing, the offer expiration date. One caveat with that: if you do that, and that's okay, because once the parties agree, when that's been signed by both parties and transmitted back, now you have a mutual agreement. That would actually be day 0, but clarify that between the parties, how they want to handle that. Or you could write that in the addendum that day 0 might have been the day that they originally signed and everybody thought they had mutual agreement. Come to agreements. The other thing is put a time frame for that addendum.
Right.
My only fear is with this situation, it's always been this way, it's not new, but if you use an addendum and not a counteroffer, so the seller shoots out to a buyer and saying, okay, I'm extending this, the offer deadline so we can get into a mutual agreement, and then the buyer's agent is MIA and nothing's signed, and a week goes by and they're thinking, well, that's dead then. And so you move on to another offer. Well, that's still kind of ticking out there. And so if you use an addendum, just make sure you put a deadline on how long that offer to extend the offer deadline is.
Yeah, this is an interesting change. And so, you know, I prepared some language for our company that we put in kind of our sample agreement form, and I'm sure that, you know, many of you have done similar things or prepared a script on how you're going to deal with circumstances like this. But it's really important for people to understand what's in black and white here and highlighted. The parties, this is on lines 497 and 498, and I'm going to reread it. the party's failure to do so shall be treated as a rejection under the seller's rejection section below, and this transaction shall be automatically terminated. If the seller signs here agreeing to sell after the offer deadline, and if no counteroffer or addendum is prepared, that the parties all agree that they're going to be bound by that late acceptance, then it's going to be treated as a rejection and automatically terminated.
Yep.
So it has to be done. It's not optional. And I agree with you that in that addendum, and I would recommend the use of an addendum instead of a counteroffer.
Okay.
But my personal preference. Because I think when you counteroffer, now you've counteroffered, right? Instead of accepting the offer, you've made a counteroffer, which is by its own nature a rejection of the offer, right? And you're saying here, I agree to sell instead of I'm making an attached counteroffer. So how do you agree to sell and then make a counteroffer, right? So for those purposes, just logistically, I think an addendum makes more sense. But the addendum not only should say that the parties agree to the late acceptance, but the timelines for all contingencies begin on the date that you put in there. You should have that language in that addendum.
Yep.
So all parties are clear, even if, the buyer's agent is missing in action for a couple of days and the buyer doesn't sign that addendum for 3 or 4 days, they're signing saying, I agree that the time periods began on this day. Even if it's in the past, they're agreeing to the time periods beginning on that date. So I think that's a really important point to clarify, and I would encourage you to talk with your managing broker. And for those of you with larger companies that might be listening, I would encourage you to have a policy kind of across all offices that makes sense for your companies. I know we do, and I'm sure you guys do too, and we've prepared language that I think will be helpful for our agents and instructions to say, if if the seller accepts after the deadline or on a counteroffer, if the buyer accepts after the deadline, here's what you need to do and how you need to do it. And I think that's important.
I think it's very good.
The other byproduct of this that I think is really good, we're in a market, and whether the market's transitioning or not is up to your interpretation of the market right now. But the bottom line is, some of the games that get played are buyers putting a short time window of expiration on their offer because they want to try and back a seller up against the wall. I want to make a good offer, but I want you to accept it right now, right? Mm-hmm. That's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is the seller might say, hey, you made me a great offer, but I'm going to sit on it for 3 or 4 days and see if I get any better offers that might come in, okay? Because I can always just accept it after it's expired, and you can always just check the box that you agree to be bound by it. Well, now the process is a little different. Mm-hmm. And maybe that timeline that expiration of the offer is a little more real for the seller and the buyer because it's dead. If they don't do an addendum saying, hey, we agree, we all agree, and everybody's clear, it's dead, right? So I just think that maybe it'll help that, and it might help sellers and buyers understand and be more amicable in how they negotiate based upon that real timeline. It's a real deadline.
Perfect. I like that.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. The other thing, there's no yellow because there's no section. You'll note here that there's no acknowledgement section.
Yeah.
There's a couple reasons for that. One, contractually, it meant nothing as far as you have a binding contract without the acknowledgement.
Right.
Managing principal brokers really got tired of writing the word acknowledgement because it was always missing.
No, never.
And it was just a pain. So I don't think I've had anybody not say yay to that one. However, the acknowledgement section was set in there originally because back when we're having multiple copies of the sale agreement, and OAR wanted to make sure that whether you're the buyer or the seller, you received all of the documents that had been part of the agreement. So that's really what I'm acknowledging that I received all this. It also said that they completely understood it, which was I'm sure. But that was what that was what the acknowledgement was all about. But now again with the electronic signatures, and they're having access of almost all the forms anyway. But just as a standards of practice, the concept of the client getting all of the documents is still a sound and a good one. So let's say you wrote the original offer and it wasn't by DocuSign or by electronic signature, and then later on it all was electronic signatures. Well, they don't have a copy of that. If you did that in Starbucks and then you took it with you, they might not have it. So just as a standard of practice, just make sure, certainly by the end of the sale agreement, and I know most people do anyway, that you make sure that your client has a complete copy of all the documents that were done during the course of their transaction.
Yeah, that's a fiduciary responsibility, by the way.
Yep.
Yeah.
So.
All right, is that it? Really, we took away the acknowledgement signature this year. Can I high five you for that? Thank you. Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's a huge change, and I hope that it helps people to understand and clarify when you do have signed acceptance of the offer and when you don't, and it doesn't confuse the issue. And I do think it'll save a lot of backtracking and people, you know, having to go back and get an acknowledgement signature when their client's like, what the heck are you even, you know, why?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. All right, great. Well, that's the sale agreement.
That's the sale agreement.
So, but there are changes to other forms.
There are?
Yeah.
Okay, let's look. Okay.
Let's talk.
Okay, first off, the buyer's counter.
It's one page.
Well,
And
it
the
always
seller's
was.
counter is one page.
Yeah, the seller's counter is one. You stole my thunder.
I'm sorry.
However, because we took out the late acceptance and the
Yeah.
acknowledgement section and just added these 4 lines, which are exactly the same as on the sale agreement, it made it shorter. So, that we can just go ahead and scroll
Yeah.
to page.
And I'm going to say, again, my logic for recommending the use of an addendum instead of a counteroffer document is you've got a counteroffer, somebody signs it after the expiration of the counteroffer, you're going to counter again. I think the appropriate document really is an addendum. So, just my 2 cents. Okay?
So, one page, which I'm thrilled about on the seller's counter.
Good, that's
All
good.
right. So moving on, we're going through. Okay, now this section here.
This is the vacant land.
This is a vacant land sale agreement.
Okay.
Okay.
And this is page 14. It's not page 14 of the vacant land sale agreement.
No, it's page 14
Page
of
5
your
of the
handout.
vacant land sale agreement.
Yeah, okay.
Page 14 of your handout. Yes.
Okay. So can you scroll just a
Yes,
moment?
sir.
Okay. So the way it was written before, seller vacant land disclosures, although not required, I'm on line 197. Although not required by law, unless waived by buyer in writing, seller shall complete the ORF 019 vacant land disclosure addendum. Okay, so that's the way it was, period, before. And we're coming into situations, and I know that some people maybe think the vacant land disclosure is disclosing too much, whatever the case may be. We'll talk about that here in just a second. But in the actual agreement, it's saying they have to. And it was in the boilerplate, and we had sellers that were selling vacant land go, I have to do what? Because they hadn't even heard anything about it before, because their agent wasn't aware of it, or whatever the case may be, and now the buyer's expecting it, wondering where it is. So what we did is, one, we pulled it out and made it so there's the check boxes, which are on 208 through 212 there, where they can, one, they can offer to, they want it. First off, the buyer wants it, and they also want the right to, they want a revocation period, which is part of the vacant land disclosure addendum. Or let's say they just want the information, but it's a multiple offer situation, so I want the information, but I don't want the revocation period. In that case, they could do number 2 box, or they can just sit there and say, I waive the right to the vacant land disclosure addendum. And part of that had to do with if you had a subdivision where it's all platted out, they have streets, they have curbs, they have street lights. Here's one 50 by 100 lot sitting there, and it's all of the utilities are sitting up there. Would a developer want to have this vacant land disclosure and fill out this full thing for a situation like that? Well, the buyer may ask for it, that's okay, but at least now they could get a counter and say, the seller could go, no, I'm not giving that to you. And then it can be negotiated, whatever the case may be. So I like the fact that we put this out so people are aware of what they're signing, and and the seller isn't surprised that they have to do this.
Yeah, I agree. I think a best practice on this, if you're selling vacant land, as a listing agent, you know, how you can help this conversation is at the moment of listing, by having the conversation with the seller up front, giving them a copy of the vacant land disclosure, helping them to understand it is highly likely that a buyer will ask for this document. It is not statutorily required that you complete this document or give it to them, but it is very likely that they will ask you for it. So, you know, what you need to know as a seller, if I'm your listing agent, is if you agree to fill it out, even if the buyer waives the right to receive it, I'm going to give it to them, because I'm not going to receive all of this information and not pass it on to the buyer's agent, right?
Correct.
So even if the buyer waives the right to receive it, but you've completed one, we're giving it to them. Okay, now they waived the right, so they don't have a revocation period, fine, but we're still gonna give them the form. You need to decide when you list the property, do I want to complete this document or not? And if not, okay. If a buyer makes an offer saying, hey, it's conditioned upon me receiving this document with the revocation period, if you're not willing to fill out the document and you don't want to give that to them, then we need to counteroffer that out.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
But I think an important point here as a listing agent is, just because a buyer might waive the right to receive the document completely, doesn't mean that if the seller has completed it, you can sit on it and not deliver it, right? I think that's a very bad position as a listing agent to be in. There's a lot of liability in there, and you want to give all the information, of course, that you have received from the seller.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And the other section of this, so I think we're just going to be moving on. Yeah, go ahead. We're going to be on page 14 of your handout.
We're on page
15. So here's the vacant land disclosure.
Okay. There's been some reformatting on this too, right?
I have a couple little things that they're just little tweaks that people have said, hey, we need this, we have this. And so if you're out there and you feel like we need to have this change or this change, send it in, because all of these changes here were related to people coming in and asking for this. Going along with what Jeff had just said, which is excellent, is a standard of practice on vacant land, giving this vacant land disclosure addendum to your seller, then they can be making a decision whether they do or not. So say, okay, if you don't want to, fine, but please look through this, because it's really a nice thing. They might be surprised. They went, oh, we did build that pond down on the back 40.
Yeah, sure.
I didn't remember doing that. Do you need a permit for that? And so it can trigger some things that they might not have remembered on a piece of property. So instead of just having them rejected, make sure that they look through it and see, is there anything in here that would be something that would be useful in case you don't want to do it. Sure. But you still have to disclose, because they still have the right to disclose if something is with the property that they know. I like it. Some people don't, but I think it's a good form.
I think in general, people misunderstand disclosure. I mean, whether or not a seller has to fill out a property disclosure statement, or whether or not they choose to use this document, if there's material facts about the property that they are aware of, should take an opportunity to disclose those known facts to a buyer.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? I mean, regardless of what form it's on, material information should be disclosed from the seller to the buyer, and this gives the vehicle for that.
Right.
Right.
I have a Phil Queren quote. Full disclosure doesn't create liability. The absence of it does.
Yeah. There you go.
Okay. We're going to be going through this pretty quickly. We're on page 16 here. Are there any conservation easements or agreements? That's a good line.
Yeah.
Are you aware of any above ground or underground tanks used for the purposes of whatever in use on the property? Again, some good items to put in there.
Yep.
Actually sort of surprised it wasn't in the first place, but whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm.
I had a little confusion on this. If you look on just above the yellow here, we're on page 16, line 63, if property is currently supplied from a well. So is there more than one well serving the property, and are the wells located on the property? If no, attached explanation. Some people were saying, well, if there's a well, they were confused with the no attached explanation. I think that could be, the verbiage could be improved there. But what they're talking about is if there's a well serving the property, which was the qualification up on line 63, and it's not on the property, what's going on? Do you have a shared well agreement, or whatever the case may be? That's what that section is talking about there. There was a little bit of confusion on that.
Okay.
There's that man-made ponds or bodies of water, and if yes, is there a permit? And I'm sure a lot of farms take a lot of care to get those permits.
Sure. Yeah, if you've got a real business. I mean, if you're running a real operation, you can do it, right?
And this line right here, it was reformatted. It's better. There's some sections that were a little needed improvement, and they were. Are you aware of any other condition, defect, feature, problem, material factor, issue in its immediate vicinity affecting the buyer's use and or enjoyment of this property? This is pretty strong with the immediate vicinity section right there.
Mm-hmm.
It is there. If you feel like that would need to be changed, because that is different than the property disclosure, you might want to bring in a line there. I not exactly warm and fuzzy about having to disclose things in the immediate vicinity, but because it's there, I wanted to make you aware of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, definitely, again, you're giving this document to your seller and letting them make a decision about, whether they want to complete this or whether they don't want to complete this. And, perhaps this is not a statutory form. Perhaps the seller might say, oh, I'm fine filling out what I do know, but I don't know about this. And I'm not, I'm going to check unknown if I don't know. And that's
there you go. Absolutely.
Totally legitimate. And, I don't know, I won't get too into the weeds with that, but I agree with you about raising the awareness of the language that's written in there for people to understand. Yeah, good. Okay.
And also, the last thing is instead of coming up with there was new language talking about the revocation period, and Phil determined, why do that? Why not just use basically the verbiage, though it's not by statute, the same verbiage for the revocation that's in the proper disclosure, just so it's consistent, so you're not having to reread and relearn a procedure. So basically what they've done is they've mirrored as closely as possible the language for the revocation period as the same as the proper disclosure.
Yeah, okay. Yep, makes sense to me. All right, this is the...
Okay, this is the
condominium sale agreement.
Condominium sale agreement, page...
Page 6 of the condominium sale agreement.
And page 20 of your handout. It's just a quick change, the name of the management company. Before I can't even remember what it was before because this is so obvious, this is what it should have been. So it's here, and it's also on the townhome addendum. So this is the name of the management company. We had issues with that. So
okay.
Just a quick little change, just so you're aware of that.
And you said it already, but just so everybody understands, when we make a change to the main residential sale agreement, which is OREF-001, that's the primary document, right? Yes. All of the other sale agreements for formatting purposes get those changes as well. So promissory note, acknowledgement signatures, all of those things apply to all of the sale agreements in the library, not just the one. So what you're pointing out here is an additional change above and beyond the ones that we've already talked about.
Yes, good point.
Right.
Good point.
Yeah.
Okay, now I believe we're on the new construction sale agreement, page 11, 21 of your handout.
Yep.
Okay, mediation and arbitration is exactly the same for the same verbiage as on all the other sales agreement, except there's a different situation going on here, and I think it's pretty clear by the writing here. Oregon law contains important requirements that homeowners must follow before filing for arbitration or court action, excluding small claims court, against any contractor, subcontractor, or supplier of materials or equipment for construction defects. Failure to follow these procedures or meet those deadlines will affect a homeowner's right to commence an action. If contemplating a claim after closing of this transaction, buyer should contact an attorney for information on the procedures and deadlines under Oregon law. So this is a case of, and you'll see that the Oregon Construction Contractors Board, CCB, has those forms. You have
HBA forms.
Yeah, so they have, right, you're going to have the Home Buyers Protection Act, you're going to have their lien notices and those items that discuss this for them, but this is just another clarification in here because we have run into new construction where the people say, I'm not giving you those forms, even though they're a contractor, they're supposed to, but whatever the case may be, this states that they have specific things they have to do in a certain order, in a certain way, in order to make an effective claim against the subcontractors, contractors, or suppliers. So I like the fact that they added this into the dispute resolution.
Yeah, and just as an aside, I pretty regularly have somebody come through and say, whether it's a small local builder or whatever, they don't want to use those forms. They don't want to give those notices to a buyer. They don't feel that they're necessary. They are necessary and required. Most of the major builders, national builders, have those notices built into their 90,000-page sale agreement, right?
Yes.
But if you're using the new construction sale agreement and you have a builder who doesn't have their own document with all of that information built in, you can Google. If you Google HBA forms, you're going to come up, with some information. Or the Construction Contractor Board is a good place to find that information as well. But definitely, you want to make sure that those notices are given properly.
Okay, page 22, just a quick change. It was sort of a surprise. Okay, this is going to be a standard of practice. I think most of you great agents out there are already doing it, but it's now in here. So I'll just read the whole line. The repairs corrective action shall be completed on or before there was completion date. Seller shall give buyer written notices of completion of the repair corrective action and provide any receipts for labor and materials with proof of payment in full unless being paid out of escrow.
Good.
I know a lot of agents that have been writing that in.
Yeah.
And it really needs to be done. And I was, had these discussions with an agent saying, well, the buyer didn't ask for them, so my seller's not giving them to you. And then I go, no, you're not. Your seller is going to give them to the buyer and get that information put in there. But now it's actually in there, and it's a really good thing. But again, that's putting the standard of care just a notch higher than it was before. So if you're a buyer's agent or the seller's agent, make sure that happens.
Yeah.
It's very important.
I think it's great practice, and you're right. I think a lot of people felt the need to write it in because it wasn't in the language, and always kind of wondered why it wasn't just in the language. It seems to make sense. I think it's a logical add. Yeah, good.
Okay. We just changed the name here. Let's see, is there anything else?
But no material changes to the addendum itself, other than the name of the management company, right? But other than that, that's it, right?
That's it, yeah.
The addendum itself is the same document. You just have clarified in the title that it applies if there's a homeowners association, even if the home is not a townhome or an attached property.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
Okay.
Okay. So moving to 24, just
wood stove.
Wood stove.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We've had a couple of cases where this has occurred, and so as Phil would say, anecdotally, buyer should verify with the lender, if applicable, that buyer can accept this responsibility. So responsibility is, as we know by Oregon law, if there is a non-certified or uncertified solid fuel burning device, that it has to be destroyed. They actually have to sit there and slice it into pieces and make sure that thing goes, and it doesn't even have to be attached. It can be sitting in the garage, not attached to anything, or it could be used as a planter in the backyard. By their theory, it has to be done. And so we've had, again, I think we're with the market that we've been having, trying to make it nice for the sellers. Some buyers have said, hey, that's okay, I'll take care of it. Or maybe they say, actually, I don't mind having an uncertified stove. I kind of like it, I'd rather keep it. And so they'll mark this section, responsibility, down here, where the buyer takes on the say, I'll do it. Seller doesn't have to do it before closing. I'll do it within 30 days, which is the statute. So they all initial that, and that's all good, that the buyer's going to take care of that after. Whether they are or not doesn't make a difference. That's what they've agreed to. Well, if there's a loan involved, we've had two just in my office where the lender saw this and went, nah, you need to get that thing taken care of.
Yeah.
So the sellers, they've already agreed to it. Here it is 3 days before closing, and the underwriter is saying that the wood stove has to be destroyed and they need verification. And it slowed down 2 different closings just in my office. So I know that's happening. So again, a nice point when you're talking through this, if somebody's thinking about doing that and there is a loan involved, be sure that the buyers verify with the lender that buyer can accept this responsibility and there won't be a problem with the loan.
Yeah, and I would say in my experience that the rule will be that the lender will require the wood stove be removed. I've yet to see one where they were okay with an uncertified device being left at the property. So, okay.
Okay.
Good.
Okay, here's just a change. Again, with the change of name, that's really the main change here. It used to be an exclusive buyer service agreement. So if you're looking under the buyer service agreement, you'd look under E. Now you look under B.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. So just keeping that.
It's a different reason than I thought for the reason for the name change. So that's good. That's more simple. That's simpler. That's great.
Okay. And now we're down to page 26, seller fee agreement. Just a little subtle change here. Mm-hmm. This took 2 years to, I think, finally get it dialed in, but this thing was basically stating that the agreement was between a seller and an agent. And most of the verbiage last year was changed to say it was seller will pay principal broker. But somehow this last entire agreement was off, and it was talking about the agent, seller. It said seller and agent on line 35. Now it says principal broker, and the agreement is between the seller and the principal broker. So that's just basically, that's Oregon law. It can't be between an agent. So we just clarified it so it's dialed in.
And I want to say that on this document, and if I scroll back up, sorry if I'm giving anybody a headache, that on the buyer service agreement, we don't have page 2 of the buyer service agreement here, that there's no longer a place for the principal broker to sign, right? It's just the seller or the buyer and their agent to sign. I think the principal broker signature line was removed from both of those forms this year as well.
Okay.
I remember seeing that anyway.
All right.
So that makes sense because oftentimes, you know, the agent is the one signing the agreement on behalf of their company, which they can do.
Right.
And so, you know, that makes sense to me. So, okay. All right, good. Agreement to occupy. Some changes here, right?
Yes. This was a major rewrite. Most of the language, really most, a high percentage is the same. But what was found, this was one of those documents where things were built in and somebody said, hey, we should put this clause in and maybe we should put this clause in, etc. And it ended up being a mishmash a bit. So we went through, and this was really a field project and another gentleman who did a fabulous amount of work on this, putting this together and tightening it up. Of the one document, really, you should read through them all, right? But since this is being used quite a bit, especially in this market, I encourage everybody to read through this. If you print this out, read the whole thing. Talk it over with you. It would be a good topic for a branch meeting for sure. Reading through this document is really important because there's some very specific things going on here. So one of the points are here, just like we were talking about the wood stove and a lender going, nah, fix it. We were having situations here where in this market somebody said, hey, as you know, by Oregon statute, this can be up to 90, agreement to occupy after closing can be up to 90 days without creating a landlord-tenant situation. It's just sort of this little niche for a sale. Well, we also, if there's a lender involved, you have the occupied loans and then the investment property loans, which have different interest rates and different down payment requirements and things like that. And so they don't want to see somebody using a owner-occupied and getting an owner-occupied rate with all those terms, but they're actually just immediately intending just to rent this thing out. And so one of the things that they're concerned about is that length of time. So in this case, buyer agrees to verify with buyer's lender that the agreed upon term provided herein is permitted by its underwriting department. I've yet to see anything over 60 days.
Yeah, me too.
I have seen a 30-day. That was quite a surprise. Apparently California is all 30 days, so maybe that's coming our way. But whatever, it could be 35. I've seen a 45, and I've seen mainly 60s. But really, this is a good conversation to have, or you have it before you even write this offer, because people are agreeing to terms that the lender won't allow, and that can cause a big headache in the transaction.
Yeah, and unfortunately, oftentimes it causes the headache at the closing table when the buyer's agreeing to, under notary, sign a document stating that they will occupy the property within 60 days, and, you know, they say, oh, wait a minute, but we agreed to possession after closing for the seller for 90 days, so we aren't going to be occupying within 60 days. Now you really do have kind of a big problem.
Yeah.
So this is important clarification, yeah.
Okay. So moving on down through here, I won't go through this, but it's talking about the late fees. Typically, I don't see this being an issue because in pretty much everyone I see, if there's compensation involved, it's paid at closing.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to go through that, but again, read through the whole thing there. The seller's obligations and then the next one that's going to come up on the next page are important. Well, it's all important, but this one. Seller's obligation, I'm going to go through down to line 30. Okay, we're on page 27, sorry. On line 36, C, keep the property, including the interior and exterior of all structures, the grounds, trees, shrubbery, and all landscaping in a clean, neat, safe, and orderly appearance and condition consistent with its appearance and condition at the time of closing. Okay, at the time of closing. Which buyer shall have the right of inspection to confirm prior to closing. And then I believe there's, I missed the one that talked about federally controlled substance. So,
yeah.
So we know which one that one is. That's the main one. that's between state and federal. But, okay, on this line here, the idea was, okay, if you're going to go rent a car, what are you going to do? The first thing that you do when you rent a car is you're going to walk around and look at where the dings were, right? Or if you're going to rent an apartment, you're going to walk around with your landlord now and say, okay, that there's something fault here, just so you know what the condition of the property is prior, so when you give it back to them, they're going to check against this base, level base of where that it was, which is protection for both parties, right? This is what the intent of this section is. So just before closing, the buyer has the right to go in and say, just go around the house and say, okay, this is what the house looks right now, so that's how I'm going to be expecting it to look 60 days from now. That's my baseline, and that's what I'm going to be doing. So that's what this walkthrough is through. It's not a contingency where they can get out or whatever. There's other issues that are involved with the sale agreement. It hasn't closed yet, but this is just to create that baseline for what's going to be, even though it's not the rental period.
Thank you for clarifying that, because I think there's some question about that. Does this language on this document create essentially a walkthrough clause for the buyer, which in our form, we don't have? Does state in the sale agreement that the seller is obligated to deliver, possession of the property in substantially the same condition it was in at the time that the buyer made their offer, including all of the landscaping and everything else, right? So they can't stop mowing the lawn, they can't have a rager at the house and, leave a big mess. Mm-hmm. So I think that's been the question here is, does this mean now that the buyer has a right of a walkthrough where they could come through and say, oh, we don't approve of the condition of the property? And I don't read it that way. And I think that what I hear you saying is the buyer shall have a right of inspection to confirm, meaning that all of this is true, that you see the condition of the property at closing, prior to the seller's occupancy period, and you know what the condition of the property is. You'll confirm that it matches the condition that it should be in upon closing, right?
Right.
And then from there, once you get the keys, if there's been any damage or any issue after closing, that's where the security deposit will come into play. I think it clarifies that. I think that's a good addition, but I can see people getting confused about that. So I think your explanation is helpful on that. I think that's good.
Okay, this section right here, and this is one you're definitely wanting to be covering. Obviously, you don't go through and read everything to your clients, but this would be is a good section to have a conversation with if they're doing this agreement to occupy after closing. Who's responsible for what? So maintenance, repair, replacement responsibilities. So the seller's responsibilities on line 42 were on page 28
of the packet, right?
And it's 11 o'clock. We're going to need to talk faster. Seller's responsibilities. In addition to seller's obligations at section 5, which we just talked about or we briefly went through, seller shall at seller's sole expense keep and maintain all heating, cooling, electrical, water, plumbing, and irrigation systems, including wells and septic if applicable, and all appliances in good working order, and perform any repairs to the property necessitated by the negligent, reckless, or willful misconduct of seller or seller's guests, invitees, or pets. So the first section says basically, I'm here, this is different than a rental situation, right? And so a little thing, the sink starts dripping, and something like that. That would be the seller's responsibility to keep that in good working order if it hadn't done it prior to that. The seller needs to pay for that. And the second section is, let's say when they're moving out, their friends who had too much beer slid the refrigerator across the hardwoods and made a great big gash in the hardwoods. That was negligent. They would have to take care of that.
Okay.
So there's the seller's responsibilities. The buyer's responsibilities, in the event, now the buyer, again, is now the owner in this situation.
Right.
In the event that any of the systems or appliances in the property fail and cannot, in the opinion of a qualified inspector, vendor, or other expert selected by a buyer who has inspected the same, be repaired so as to continue operating in a safe, efficient, and cost-effective manner for the remainder of the term, it shall be promptly replaced by buyer at buyer's sole cost. Seller shall cooperate with buyer to provide access at all reasonable times for such inspection and, if applicable, replacement. In other respects, the cost of all maintenance and repairs of said systems and appliances shall be borne by seller as described above. So the furnace blows up on day 4 after the occupancy. It's already closed. It can't be repaired. That expense would be the buyer's responsibility. They own the house.
It's their furnace.
It's their furnace. They need to take care of it.
Right.
So just maintaining, minor repairs, that's the seller. They're living there. That's different than, but if it's just gone, it's the buyer's responsibility, which also makes sense with now they're, okay, I have to put in a new furnace, and that wasn't what they were hoping to do, but
It's their home.
it's their home.
So I understand this, that the basic maintenance, right, because the seller is saying, we're going to give you possession of the property in the condition that it's in when you do this walkthrough, which is the condition that it should have been in, based upon the language in the sale agreement, at the time that you made your offer.
Correct.
Right? It had a functioning furnace. Something goes wrong and we got to fix the furnace. We're going to do that because you've allowed us to live here, and it's our responsibility to make sure that when we turn the possession of the property over to you, furnace still works.
Yep.
Right? Now, but that doesn't mean that we're going to replace a furnace that has gone defunct, after closing. It's your home. It's your furnace. We're going to make sure it works when you get it, but if the furnace has completely gone haywire and is no longer functioning, well,
It's your house.
it's your house. Right.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think I understand that line. I can see some confusion potentially about that, but I think it's clear. And
It is clear, and it was a big discussion going about what
I'm sure.
basically the philosophy of how we were going to be proceeding, because before it was really fuzzy. So it's clear now. Anyway, so moving forward.
Yep.
Seller shall have delivered possession of the property to buyer together. Basically, this is basically reiteration, so that we can move forward on that line. We're
Okay.
Sliding up to page 29. Insurance. Here's a change. Buyer shall secure a policy of casualty insurance on the property for its full insurable value, and seller shall secure a policy of liability insurance listing buyer as an additional insured in an amount of not less than $1 million. It used to be $500,000 if not filled in. Now it says $1 million, so that's a big change. And on liability, $500,000 is not much of it. I think that's why they put that higher. A lot of this language was run by an insurance agent.
Good.
So to make sure it's correct, but we're also hearing out there from the agents that sometimes the seller contacts their insurance company and states, oh, you don't have to do that, we'll just cover this for these few days with the policy you have, or we'll do it for this amount of time, or whatever the case. Just make sure your duty is to inform your client of what the contract and what they're agreeing to do is, and try to comply with that, so they can come back to that, because if there was a discrepancy and they didn't do that, that wouldn't be a good place to be, because we're talking about some fairly substantial amounts there. So be sure and read that section and have them contact their insurance agent on that.
Yeah, and I'm going to make the assumption that, it seems difficult for me to understand, if you're not the owner of the property anymore, how your insurance policy for the property you don't own still is effective, right? I'm not an insurance broker,
right,
but that seems like that doesn't seem rational to me. So I think an honest conversation with your insurance broker based upon whatever they're recommending to you is important. If you're a seller purchasing the property, or, and you're occupying after closing, and the buyer's purchasing the property, is it suitable if your insurance broker says, oh, just keep your homeowner's insurance policy in place and you're good to go, it's only a couple of days? Is that legitimate coverage?
Yes.
And that's a fair question. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying ration dictates that there might be a problem.
I agree.
Yeah, rationality dictates that. So, okay, all right.
Okay. And it also says that real estate agents are not experts, so we know that already. Okay, sellers' failure to vacate. This always seems to be a concern of buyers. I don't know what the difference is between occupancy at closing and occupancy a week later, but people are concerned about that because a seller could say, I'm not moving even at closing. But whatever the case may be, this was put in here. If seller remains in possession of the property beyond the term provided herein, buyer may deliver to seller a written notice to vacate within 24 hours. Seller has not if seller has not fully vacated the property following delivery or transmission of said 24-hour notice, buyer may thereafter file for eviction pursuant to the ORS statute. In addition, upon seller's failure to vacate the property within said hours. And then I'm just going to stop there right for a second. I'm liking that we have the additional statutes in here. If you look at the statutes, the first statute, because this is not a landlord-tenant situation, they've carved out a space specifically for the situation with occupancy after closing.
Okay.
That's the first section. The second section that they're talking about there really is the same as if it was a lease where your tenant was refusing to leave. The procedure is all the same. So I like the fact that they're there because, and to be, for the buyer who's the owner, able to access those two different sections because they have to be done perfectly. As we all know, tenants have a lot of power in the state, and so they have to be notified and given the proper amount of notice. It has to be delivered by the correct form, maybe not certified mail, has to be regular mail, has to be on the door, whatever the case may be. Having this language here should help alleviate some of those concerns by people saying, what do I do if they don't leave?
Okay.
Okay, and then the other one, this was added. There's three choices. Line 104 and 105 are the same as they were. An amount that was, the third one was added, an amount equal to the daily principal, interest, taxes, and insurance accruing under buyer's notes and trust deeds for each day following the date that buyer is entitled to possession of the property. Okay, I'm glad that we added it. My personal take is that's not enough.
Yeah. It just is extending the occupancy period essentially under the buyer's expenses. Yeah, I hear you. So,
but talk to your managing principal broker what you're wanting to do. I think we're more pleased with the second option. Sometimes but whatever the case, we're not going to get into that. That's the third option that's available now.
Yeah, I also will make the caution, which I made last year when I was in your position, or maybe it was the year before, I don't remember.
It's all a blur.
It's all a blur. Anyway, line 104, if you're putting in a liquidated damage sum, if you're the buyer's agent and you're the one filling this out, boy, I'd be real careful about putting that amount in there, right? Because whatever amount you put in there is what it's going to be. Mm-hmm. And if it's not enough to cover the actual damages or, you know, the buyer's damages, you might have a problem. Right?
I agree.
So I'm not a fan of line 104. I was hopeful it might get removed, but maybe someday. You never know.
Jeff brought that in as a suggestion.
Yeah, okay. All right.
Okay, so we went through the end of that.
Yep.
So we're just kind of scrolling along. Just a small change here. We're on page 31 of your handout.
Professional inspection addendum.
Professional inspection addendum. This is one of those things where sometimes just things happen in the middle of the night. We're not quite sure how it happened, but in the sale agreement, it states this line: buyer understands that buyer is responsible for the restoration of the property following any inspections, tests performed by buyer or on buyer's behalf. We all think it used to be on this form as well, but it just disappeared.
Yeah.
So it's back in there, which it needed to be.
Sure.
And that was brought in by somebody saying, hey, where is that?
Where is it? Yep.
Okay, investment property addendum, page 32. And these last pages go pretty quick, so I think we'll be okay.
Yeah, we might even have time for some questions.
Yay! Okay. They're trying to clarify this investment property addendum with the line at the top. This addendum is primarily designed for the sale of rental property consisting of 1 to 4 family dwelling units or plexes. If this transaction involves larger properties, a more detailed list of due diligence items may be appropriate. It's a nice little disclaimer, though this thing is quite comprehensive in what
yeah, but you would use, I mean, if it's more than 1 to 4 dwelling units, you would use the commercial sale.
Right, yeah.
And most of the provisions of this would be within
that stuff.
Yeah.
So it was really good to go. And it's talking about, again, they're clarifying the documents. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the documents. I'll just read it. By 5 p.m. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to just say something real quick. You know, for those of you, as we've been going through this, this is the handout that Steve had. This was a cut and paste of the documents that were being revised in the process of revision. You see an incorrect word here. This addendum is primarily designed for the date of rental property consisting.
Right.
I'm sure that the actual form does say sale now instead of date.
Right, because
so just keep that in mind. I'm sure that you might have questions about that. This is not the actual addendum as it is in the ZipLogic OREF library. Those changes they get tweaked and beta tested and all of that.
All that.
Okay. All right.
Okay. So it's talking about the rights. So a buyer gets all these these materials, these documents, and so it's talking by 5 p.m. of the final day of the document review period, section 8 below. Not all documents and information may be readily available to seller. Buyers, sellers, and agents should promptly determine what documents and information are necessary and can be reasonably provided within the document review period. If obtaining any documents and information may be delayed, it is suggested that buyer and seller reach written agreement for an extension of time before expiration of the document review period, which is good. The other but I think it brings up a really good point here, and this is with all of them, whether it's HOA docs, or any time where or septic docs, or whatever the case may be, once the seller has given all the documents to the buyer, memorialize that in an addendum, saying, okay, this is all we have. You asked for all this stuff, but we didn't have all this stuff. This is what we have.
Yep.
So you can start the document review period. That's an advantage for both parties, but in particular the seller, to do that. So be sure in any of those cases, once the seller's given, that's all I've got. You asked for all these things. I didn't. Say what you did, what ones you don't have, and get that document review period started.
Good.
Okay, the other part that was changed here, other than a couple of things, was in most residential, and again, this is really an investor seller selling to an investor buyer. That's really
typical. Yeah.
That's the one where you're mainly using this. And in residential, people were saying, wow, there's 2 pages of boxes to check here. What do I need? And so we tried to help a bit by having the basic information, and and I won't read through them. You can read them yourself. But the basic information is now in the first 8 boxes, so you don't have to go search through them.
Okay.
And then also on the one that some other people like, we put it first on the line 34, last 3 years Schedule E's, Form 1040, or comparable business schedule returns of entity owner. We put that line in because one seller said, hey, I don't have a Schedule E. I have a business schedule, so I'm not going to give you anything.
Okay.
Which was silly on the seller's part, but that just clarified that. Okay, let's move on down.
Okay.
Everything else is the same. They just made it, clarified what an inspection report was.
Right.
And, okay, keep going. Everybody.
Looks like that's it, huh?
That's it. Yep.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Good.
Septic
Name
on-site.
change.
Yeah. Septic on-site. We're going to make this in time. It's 11:10. We're good. Again, we changed it from on-site to septic, and then there was a so it starts with an S instead of starting with an O.
Got it.
And down here in this section, this just clarified what documents and how what's going on with the documents. Before there were conflicting clauses above, and so it wasn't clear. So we tightened that up for the documents. So within 5 business days after buyer and seller have signed and accepted this agreement, the party responsible for paying for the above selected services shall have the services ordered from a licensed service provider, and thereafter, upon receipt, promptly submit the results to buyer, which is consistent with the repair addendum now. We were having issues with that. So anyway, so that's clarified. We have that all down. Now, there's a point here, and if you know anybody on the Forms Committee, Jeff, why don't you make the suggestion? Buyer's right to terminate transaction. Buyer shall have blank business days, 10, if not filled, and after the date buyer has received all documents and or reports from seller concerning the on-site sewage system, in which to complete all negotiations with seller regarding any matters disclosed in any documents and or reports concerning the on-site sewage system. I think 10 days is incredibly too long, and that's the default. Why? Okay, you have all the results. That's longer than any other one. So I'm not a voting member next year, but I think I'm going to bring this forward. I think that needs to be tightened up a little bit. But it's not. This is what we have right now. So if you're doing this and you don't want to have a 10-day review period on the septic system, you have the opportunity to write something else in there.
And there's an additional point of clarity. I do sell a reasonable amount of real property, not a ton, but enough that I use these forms regularly. And I think a lot of people inaccurately perceive that the time period mirrors the inspection period. The 10 business day begins upon signed acceptance of the offer. And that's not what it says.
Nope.
It's 10 business days after the date they've received the documents and reports. So, last time I had a septic inspection on a property I sold, it took 2.5 weeks to get the septic contractor out there to pump and inspect the tank. And the buyer technically had 10 business days by
After
this form after that in order to terminate based upon that provision in the sale agreement.
Right.
So you need to make sure that your buyers and your sellers understand the time period, and especially for the seller, that they understand, hey, the septic inspection, and by the way, the well testing inspection is similar. The
Correct.
time periods are different, but they don't begin upon signed acceptance. The buyer's right of termination begins upon delivery of the information in both of these systems.
Correct.
And that's different.
That's a very big point.
I think
Good.
it's a point of clarity for most agents. They don't necessarily understand that. Okay, good. Contingent right to purchase.
Oh, yeah. Jeff and I are at one with this. Okay.
How many years in a row have we revised this form? Three. This is 3 years in a row. I think we've revised.
I am not going to be on a task force.
But I think that you guys nailed it this time. I think you got it. I think
All right.
you nipped it in the bud, man.
Thank
I'm
you, Jeff.
excited for you.
All right, yay. Okay. The big change here, and it's important for you as the agents, but we'll just do the real easy one here at the beginning. This Section 2, status of listing a buyer's property, was not there at all. And so now it is, where it says a buyer's property is currently listed for sale with a licensed real estate agent, not a FSBO, where said property is located, or a buyer's property will be listed for sale with a licensed real estate agent where said property is located within 3 business days if not filled in after seller has signed and accepted this sales agreement. I'm very happy we put that verbiage in there.
Yeah, me too.
They need to get that going.
Good clarification.
Now, the reason for Section 3, and you need to be paying attention when you're doing this, is as we get further down, there's going to be an Alternative 1 and Alternative 2, which are the options for this contingency section, which we'll cover here in just a second. There was a lot of confusion that they had to the parties had to decide whether it was Alternative 1 or Alternative 2 at the time of agreement, as opposed to those are options.
Time of notice.
At the time of notice. So Phil came up with this idea. I thought it was a good one. It's not even on this form. Okay, Alternative 1, Alternative 2, which are exactly the same as they were. Nothing's changed. You don't have to worry about reading through all of that, but they're not even on this form, so you're not picking anything right now. So acknowledgement of related forms and additional terms. The notice to seller and notice to buyer contain certain additional terms under which this transaction will continue. Those new terms are set forth in Alternative 1 and Alternative 2 in both notices. Both notices have the exact same verbiage in both of them. By the signatures below, buyer and seller acknowledge that they have reviewed and understand them. If not fully understood, the parties should first obtain clarification through the respective agents. So, if you're going to be using a contingent right to purchase, you print all of them out at the same time. Print out the contingent right to purchase, and then right next to each other in the zip forms is the notice to the buyer and the notice to the seller. I just highly recommend just print them all out at the same time, have them there. With the understanding is you don't do the notice at the time.
Until you need it.
Until you need it, right? But print them all out, because then you'll have the terms, they'll understand the process. And also, you have to use these notices. Don't just write up on an addendum that the buyer now has an accepted offer on their property and they're proceeding, blah, blah, blah. No, you have to use the notices. This is a suite of documents, and they tie together really well. Just make sure you do that.
Yeah, you know, a use of these forms that I hadn't contemplated when we made these changes last year, 2 years ago, whenever it was, you know, I always just contemplated that if a buyer was purchasing a property and they had already sold their home and it was in closing, that would just be written into the financing contingency section. But one of the brokers at my company mentioned, no, I use the contingent right to purchase form and immediately submit the notice of to the seller and have the buyer check option 1, Alternative 1, that they've sold their home, but it's contingent still upon the closing, with all of that language, so that I'm not making up the language. The form's there. Use it. I personally, I think it's and I've done that now ever since then. I think it's a great use.
All right.
A great business practice of how to do it. So anyway, just as an aside, but this makes sense to me, and I understand. The confusion that people were having was that because Alternative 1 and Alternative 2 were defined on this document previously, people were making the assumption they needed to select one at the time of using this.
Correct.
So, okay, got it.
Okay, so just moving on forward, everything's just as
Okay.
it was.
Got it. Got it.
Okay.
I think those are good clarifications on that front part of the form. Yeah.
And we also clarify, on the notices, they really are notices. So, here, they talk about the contingency, and then there's a notice, and the seller would sign this. This is, okay, so you would be using this, of course, when they already have agreement, and the seller gets another offer, they've been in bumpable status, they've got another offer that they want to accept, and so now they're giving notice to the buyer. They would sign here, and then hand this form to the buyer.
Right.
Once that's done, you don't use the buyer's notice anymore.
Right. The buyer has to select an alternative at this point.
On this form. They don't go over and do their other one there.
Right.
Okay, then they have and we don't have time to go through this form, so we're not going to, as far as alternative 1 or alternative 2, but basically alternative 1 is they have an accepted offer, but it's still contingent on the successful close. Alternative 2 is they don't have an accepted offer, but they have the financial wherewithal to purchase it anyway.
Right.
Okay. And then the third one is they're going to terminate. And if the buyer doesn't do anything within 24 hours, then
or whatever time period
they agree to, then it terminates anyway. And so then and the buyer signs at the bottom.
Good. Makes sense to me.
And then, okay, here's where the buyer actually has received an accepted offer on their property, and now they're using the notice to seller to say, hey, I want this puppy to start going. So alternative 1 would be 99.9%. I can figure one reason why to do alternative 2, but it'd be alternative 1 in almost every case. And it's just a notice, so there's no seller signatures. It's just the buyer's signature there.
So you have to have in your file the delivery. That's why the delivered by and the method and the date and time are there, because you have to prove you delivered the notice.
Yes.
Right? And as long as you can prove you delivered the notice, that's all that's required. That's the way
That's exactly how it's written. Yep.
Yeah.
Perfect.
All right. Makes sense. Gotcha. All right. We're plugging along. FERPTA.
Oh, God. I forgot
Your favorite subject.
Okay. So, as we talked about earlier, nobody likes it. We're just going to kind of go through this 1120, so we're not going to spend a gazillion time.
So this is not a new document. We had a FERPTA tax withholding obligation advisory before, but there have been changes made to the document, right? Okay.
Part of it was to mirror the sale agreement, so we have the above million and all that language in there. And then if FERPTA applies, seller is a foreign person, even if there is an exemption, seller and buyer must complete and sign the FERPTA addendum. So they're just talking about what's going to be happening. So I want to spend more time on the addendum.
Great.
So we're moving on to page 43, I think. Yeah, we're getting close. Okay, the FERPTA addendum. All right. This is a biggie. And you'll see over here on line 23, at the end it says sellers in bold and underlined seller shall upon request. That's not how it is. That was Steve emphasizing that. But we're going to go through here. This is the section. We have not changed the law. The law has not changed, but we're trying to clarify what's going on here. Okay. So this is a case where the seller is saying they're not a foreign person. None of this applies. If seller declares the seller is not a foreign person, seller shall, upon request, sign a certificate of non-foreign status, which shall include disclosure of seller's taxpayer ID number, social security number, or employer ID number, collectively non-public personal information, NPI. The original certificate shall thereafter be held by escrow, serving as a qualified substitute as defined by FERPTA, or alternately, if escrow is unable or unwilling to serve, buyer shall hold the original certificate. The buyer shall hold the original certificate in such capacity. In such event, buyer covenants and agrees not to disclose seller's non-public personal information to any third parties unless required to do so by subpoena or court order. Okay, so this is a real biggie for really the sellers. And just a bit of background on what's going on here. Due to the law, the only way a buyer can 100% guarantee that, let's say the seller was a foreign person but somehow forgot that they complied,
or didn't know that it applied to them.
Or applied to them, or maybe something nefarious, whatever the case may be. And so it would actually qualify. The only way for a buyer to completely 100% assure that they wouldn't have something come up against them and them be responsible for that sizable amount of funds is to have a certificate in place.
Okay.
Which is just, again, crazy, but it's a law, we have to deal with it. what would certainly be the best thing is if a qualified substitute and the title company or escrow would say, okay, we'll be the qualified substitute in this circumstance.
But a lot of them won't.
A lot will not. So this is when you're not a foreign person, but anytime FERPT is involved on a side, contact your escrow and say, okay, do you guys even do this?
Sure.
Because I believe, well, check with your own. I'm not going to say which companies I don't believe do it, but it's an important point. If FERPT is involved, do it. Now, in most cases, where there's going to be a foreign status, escrow is going to flesh that out because they're going to be asking for documents, and then they can't get those documents, and they're going to be seeing it's going to be happening. But sometimes it slips through the cracks. But this is why we put this in here. Now, if I was not a foreign person and a buyer submitted this form to me and saying they had the right to get my Social Security number, I would be very hesitant to sign it. So just be careful, because I know some people are trying to protect their buyer by maybe even putting this into all their files. I think that just be aware of what's going on there.
Okay, good. I don't have anything to add.
Just ready to get cranked. Okay,
yeah.
Lease option advisory, we just changed the name, so a lease is under lease.
Okay.
And,
yeah, and that's good. The advisory, I think, is a good document.
Okay, now we're going to get done here. Okay, this is page 46. I just took this one page. This is the agency pamphlet. Last year, we went through and made the verbiage consistent, because this whole document is to make the public aware of what the heck an agent is. And it was messy, and we cleaned it up, and that was really good. But there was one thing that continued to be a problem is talking about a disclosed limited agency. And it talks about the principal broker would become a disclosed limited agent.
Right.
But they're saying, well, wait a minute, on your business card it says you're a principal broker, so you're a disclosed limited agency, so you know what the buyer's doing? It was confusing.
Okay, got it.
We went through a whole bunch of different permutations, but we figured this one line should help. If applicable, see disclosed limited agency agreement for identification of disclosed limited agents.
So they know how it is. Like my company, it's all of the reviewing brokers within my company, or all the firms managing brokers is what a lot of firms will use, or whatever.
Right.
So that the buyer and the seller are clear, the principals in the transactions. If we work for the same company, you have the buyer, I have the seller, but, our principal broker,
correct,
our supervising principal broker, managing principal broker, or whatever, is the disclosure.
Correct. So hopefully, though I'm not sure how many buyers actually read this thing, but for the two that do, it's now clear.
That's good.
Okay, lead-based paint, we already covered this, so I won't take but a minute, just a little bit further. Okay, so now it says 10-day opportunity or mutually agreed upon period, and within 10 calendar days or mutually agreed upon period. So we
just added or mutually agreed upon period.
They're all consistent.
Yep.
Okay.
Got it.
And
that's page 47 of 47. We got 8 minutes.
You're right.
Let's hit. Yeah, that clock's wrong. I'm looking at my Apple phone, and that's always right, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So let's go through some questions. Yeah.
All right.
Okay. All right. I think we'll be able to clear some of these here, hopefully, pretty quickly. So let's do that. Okay. A lot of these are. I know you can hear us. Good. Okay. Good. A copy of a PDF of this somewhere. You should have that available to you if you go into the system or on the OREF website.
We'll share them with PMAR.
And they'll be shared with PMAR too, right? Yeah. Okay, good. All right, it says midnight on the inspection period. I thought the inspection contingency period was changed last year to 5 p.m. It was. We're looking at the lead-based paint period, which is midnight. So the time period for the inspection contingency and all other time periods in the agreement is 5 p.m., and that's under the definition section of the sale agreement. Okay.
And in the definitions, it clarifies that lead-based paint can't do anything about it. That is midnight.
Right. So just for clarification, or you say the lead-based paint timeframes align with the inspection. No, that is not what I said. The lead-based paint time periods are defined on the lead-based paint addendum and in that section of the sale agreement, and they are 10 calendar days by default.
Right.
Instead of 10 business days by default, and the end of the time period is midnight by default, and the end of the time period on the inspection contingency is 5 p.m. as is stated in the definition section by default. So to clarify, the lead-based paint time frames do not align with the inspection contingency time frames. The advice that I was giving is if you want them to align, that you would make it 14 calendar days to align with 10 business days, if that's your goal.
Correct.
But that is not how it is written by default. So I hope that clarifies that. So does this mean we don't have to collect earnest money when writing an offer? Right.
Correct.
That's what we've said.
Absolutely.
Right? Okay. For bank-owned, is there a separate need for a form regarding utilities? On a bank-owned property where the bank has said we're not going to keep the utilities on, the bank will probably have their addendum stating that.
They do, and as we all know, those with the gold make the rules. So
Yeah.
That addendum would trump the sale agreement verbiage.
Yeah. The bank-owned, if the bank does not have their own addendum, then if they sign the sale agreement as it's written, they're agreeing to keep the utilities on through closing.
Absolutely.
If you know as the listing agent that they don't intend to do that, then you should prepare a counteroffer to that effect, right? Help them
Good.
understand that, okay? I don't know what's being referred to there. Can that addendum extending the offer deadline be executed after offer expiration? Steve's asking that. Yeah, so
Yes.
that was, I think, in reference to if the seller accepts the offer after it's expired, yeah, they're going to generate the addendum. They're going to say, hey, we accept the offer, but we're also submitting this addendum so that you acknowledge. And essentially, the language that I used was really just kind of a cut and paste from the language that we had in that late acknowledgement section that says all parties acknowledge and, the seller's late acceptance or the buyer's late acceptance of the counteroffer and agree to be bound by that. All parties acknowledge that the time periods for all contingencies will begin on this date.
Yep.
So, there's simple language that can be put in there, and I think that that's really important. Okay, I think a lot of these are the same person, and I think she sounds like she's got this figured out.
And as we're going through here and with just a couple of minutes, I'm seeing some nice ideas for possible changes for next year. So if you've written those up and that's something you would like the Forms Committee to look at, please submit those.
Okay. Nice compliment. I could listen to the two of you talk all day. Thank you. We got a good rapport, don't we? All right, that's great. Okay, how do I handle a situation where offer was accepted after deadline with no extension and I don't see the paperwork for several days and all parties have been acting as if there is mutual acceptance? Okay, so seller accepts an offer after it's expired and you're reviewing the file within your time period, but it's been 3 or 4 days, right? You have to review it within 7. They're supposed to submit it within 3. So it's day 6, you're reviewing it, everybody's marching along, and they've done a home inspection in order to title report, but technically they accepted it after it's expired.
Yes.
What do you do?
There's no agreement.
Right, because it says that the transaction has been actually terminated automatically, right?
Correct.
So even if it's after the fact, I, as the managing broker, if I were reviewing that file, would tickle my agent and say, you need to get an addendum stating that all parties agree to be bound by the late acceptance and acknowledge the date of the time periods to begin for the contingency.
Absolutely. That's
even if it's that far late in the game, I still think you need the addendum.
Oh, you absolutely need the addendum.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
And that's actually the part that's nice now. If it's 1 day, 2 days, 7 days, it's going to be the same procedure instead of having a separate procedure. Also, the thing is nice, I know that there's some legal minds out there that feel like you can't resurrect a dead file. Well, we've been doing that anyway, a dead contract. I've heard that from people. So once it's dead, it's dead. But we actually have that language now in there that says, no, contractually, you're agreeing to, if it is actually a late acceptance, that this will put people back into mutual agreement. And I'm really happy we have that language now, because before, you could do it for 2 business days, but after that, it was very gray.
And how often did you, as a managing broker, see that the agreement to be bound by came well after the 2 business day time period that was defined?
Oh, yeah.
So did you have a legitimate deal there too? I think the other thing that you have to keep in mind is that there's an intent, right? Are the parties moving forward with the intent to an agreement? I don't know. I mean, that's up to an attorney to tell them, do they have an agreement at that point or not? But I do believe that if push comes to shove, everybody's going to be looking at the intent and what actions did you take and what was the intent of those actions.
Perfect.
So, okay, all right.
Okay, I think we're done.
I think we are done. A few other questions that have just come in, stating the timelines for the inspections. I think we've done that already. The form's pretty clear on that. Language last year that the earnest money a client trust account could request funds within a certain time frame and the agent was required to refund. Does that still apply? I'll let you read through the document on that, talk with your managing broker about that if you're using the client trust account. And a lot of people aren't anymore for very specific reasons. What if the offer is accepted within the timeline, but the delivery doesn't take place until days after? Good question, and that's why the language is specific. It says it has to be accepted and delivered. So it has to be delivered.
Yeah, please don't get in that situation.
Yeah. Last question, is the investment addendum required? No, it's not required, but if you're representing a buyer purchasing an investment property, I think the standard of care would be that you would use that addendum or recommend its use to your client.
Absolutely.
Okay, good.
Well,
Everybody's saying it. They like it. I think we've answered all the questions. It's 11:30. People like listening to us, Steve. I think we did a good job. All right, thank you.
We want to take a poll.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a great day.